I mean, if you think about it, within the veil, which veil are we talking about? We mentioned this on Wednesday night, but let's just hit it again real quick. Because there were really two veils in the temple or the tabernacle. He has more in mind the tabernacle, but they both fit. Two veils. Which veil are we talking about?
Separates us from God.
Okay, the second veil. Well, the reality is that both veils separated most of the people from God, right? Both veils did. Because who could enter the first veil? Only the priests. The Levites, on rare occasion, were allowed to go into the tabernacle. The Levites could do that. Once the priests had covered all of the holy items, the Levites could go in and then transport those items when they were moving the camp from place to place. But only the priests technically could go into the first veil, and they had to go in for specific purposes and specific services of worship to God. So the rest of the people were excluded from going through that veil even. But into the second veil, the most holy place, only the high priest could go, and he could only do it once a year. And again, he had to follow specific ordinances and statutes and instructions from God in order to enter into that place, to be in the place where God had said he would cause his presence to dwell over the Ark of the Covenant between the cherubim. So this second veil is the one that's in mind, and as Samantha said, it is not the one that is within the tabernacle or the one that was at this particular time within the temple. It is heaven itself. Because it's not the symbolic presence of God that existed during the time of Israel's encampment and their journeying, where God said he would cause his presence to dwell over the cherubim, or between the cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant. It's not the symbolic presence of God. We are able to, through Jesus, be anchored securely and enter into the true veil, which is heaven, which is the presence of God. I think it's important for us not to think of heaven so much as a location, like that it's some faraway place in space. Heaven is being in the presence of God. That is what heaven is. So if you want to talk about a location, that's the location. Wherever that is, which in some sense, we know the Bible teaches that God is where? He's all present. He's anywhere and everywhere. He is not confined to a location. But to be in his presence eternally is what we long for, and that is where our hope is anchored, sure and steadfast. But then there's a person mentioned that it's anchored to. Oh, come on. This is easy. Who's the person it's anchored to? To Jesus. It's anchored to Jesus. Why is it anchored to Jesus? Because he is the Hebrew writer says at the end of the book, or the end of this chapter, he is the forerunner. What other words are used? Pioneer. I think there's a translation that uses the word trailblazer too, which they're all the same concept. But what is the idea of a pioneer or a forerunner? I like the word pioneer because it takes us back to the early days of this country. What did the pioneers do? They made a path. They were trailblazers. They were forerunners. They went on before other people came, right? We talk about the explorers or the pioneers that traveled west from the colonies that were originally established when people came over to this country. And they found the way, they found the path to these wonderful lands where people could go and establish their homesteads and begin societies in different places. And so they blazed these trails and figured out the best ways to get there. And then there began to be these paths that were set up, trails. Because the first one that came to my mind was the Oregon Trail. And so they would set up these trails, these paths that people would go on. But they were the forerunners. They were the ones who went first for the other people who would follow. And that is the imagery the Hebrew writer uses here of Jesus. What are the ways that Jesus is a pioneer or a trailblazer or the forerunner? And I think there are a couple of them. But you may have trouble reading my mind because that's a scary place to be. What are some ways Jesus is the forerunner?
We know that he ultimately became a sacrifice that no other sacrifice
Okay.
would be in a way that no one else could qualify.
Okay, so using the words of John 14, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by him, right? So as Justin said, he was the one who provided the sacrifice that was ultimately, that made it possible ultimately for us to be reconciled to God. We're going to talk about later in this book, especially in Hebrews 10, but the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer and all the things that they did in the old covenant could not provide forgiveness of sins. Only Jesus' blood could do that. And so he becomes the forerunner, the trailblazer, the pioneer, in that it is through his sacrifice that ultimately we have the path to be able to go to God and be able to enter into his presence. And that imagery, again, will be used later in chapter 10 when the Hebrew writer talks about us passing through the veil, and it's talking again about the second veil into the presence of God, but the Hebrew writer uses a different concept or metaphor or uses the veil as a different metaphor in that place, because he says we are able to enter in through the veil which is his flesh. So it is through Jesus and his sacrifice that we are able to enter into the presence of God. Not a curtain, but through him and through what he has done. Greg?
Justin refers to the image of the old covenant of the sacrifice, but there's another imagery of the high priest or priest.
Yes.
In that we no longer have a human advocate, we have a direct heavenly advocacy. I don't know which of these symbols was more impactful as a Jew, because I've never been a Jew, but they're almost two sides of the same coin in a way.
Right.
When we talk about the multiple ways you can view this concept of being a trailblazer, one could argue too that the trailblazer set the path for others to follow, but he also established residency as a pioneer would.
Yes.
And so once there's a homestead establishment of Jesus in the presence of God, he says, you can come to me, I won't come to you.
That's right.
And so there's that idea or that imagery of having been the one to go ahead, survey the land, find it to be good, and tell others, you need to come where I am because it's good here.
Right.
So there's lots of sides or facets of this.
Yeah, and that's there in John 14 too. I mean, if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And so that picture is there too. I'll give you the last way that I think this idea of a pioneer is established. The pioneers went before and showed the way to get there, and we could look at that as the sacrifice. But the other reality is that in Jesus, God incarnate, we see what it really looks like to have a relationship with God and what God intended for mankind from the very beginning as far as how we would live and how we would walk with him while we were here. And so Jesus shows us all that too. He is our example. He not only is the sacrifice for our sin that establishes the path by which we can enter the veil, he is also the one who demonstrates for us what it looks like to walk with God now so that we can walk with God eternally. And so the difference is he did it perfectly. We don't. But that's okay. Because of him, we don't have to still get there. But it doesn't mean we don't strive, and it doesn't mean that we don't follow his example. So, but all those ways describe Jesus or illustrate the way that Jesus is a forerunner going on our behalf. And then he ends chapter 6 by saying this phrase again that we've seen before in chapter 5, that he has become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And so chapter 7, far from being a completely different thought, begins by saying, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, and to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. Okay, so that tells us where we can find Melchizedek. Most of us are probably familiar with Melchizedek because we've studied Hebrews before. But let's be honest. If we hadn't studied Hebrews, and the Hebrew writer didn't bring Melchizedek out, Melchizedek might very well be one of those people that just gets forgotten in the long scheme of people that are mentioned in the Old Testament. Because how many times is he found in the Old Testament? Okay, I heard, and that's good. I heard disagreement. I heard one, and then I heard two. Why did some of you say two? Because you're right. Huh? Psalm 110 mentions him. But really, is it about Melchizedek there? Not really. It's about Jesus. But anyway, but he is mentioned there. But it's okay to think that it was only once, because if you're talking about historically, and in reality, he is only found one time. So you're both right to some extent. There are two passages that mention him, but there is really only one occasion in which he shows up in history. And as far as the historical narrative is concerned, he's never mentioned again. The only reason he's mentioned again is in Psalm 110, and it's with reference to Jesus and the fact that his priesthood is according to the order of Melchizedek, which is what we're actually seeing quoted here and in chapter 5 and talked about in chapter 7. So he's found that one time. So he doesn't seem all that important until he's mentioned again in Psalm 110 and then brought up so many times in Hebrews. But what was the occasion, and don't just give me what the Hebrew writer says, give me a little bit of the historical background with regard to what happened with Abraham. What is the occasion that Melchizedek comes on the scene and that we're introduced to him the first time? Do you remember? Yes, we know from the Hebrew writer it was from the slaughter of the kings, but what was that? What was going on? Okay. Go ahead, Jim, and then I'll...
Well, it was when some servants and people that were servants of Abraham and others, and there was these marauders that came and took them away. And so the whole idea was they got together with some other kings and went and ganged up on these dudes, and I don't know if you want to call them dudes, but anyway, recouped them. Plus, there were spoils involved.
Yes.
And so then spoils, somehow Abraham went before Melchizedek and paid homage to him and offered an offering.
Okay. So it was in recovering these servants, and also part of his family, Lot, and his household were taken captive by these kings. And Abraham and some others that he gathered together went to rescue them. And as Jim said, they were victorious over these kings. And there were spoils that were won. And on their way back, Melchizedek met Abraham and blessed him in the return from the slaughter of the kings. And Abraham apportioned a tenth of the spoils from this battle as a tithe to God through Melchizedek, because Melchizedek was king of Salem, but he was also a priest of God Most High, or of the Most High God. And so this imagery is used with reference to the priesthood or the high priesthood of Jesus. I do find it interesting. I just want to make brief mention. I've mentioned this before, but I find it interesting that Abraham apportioned a tenth, because where does the tithe actually become law, so to speak? We even talk about this with regard to our offerings today, that we're called on to give as we have purposed in our heart, with a cheerful heart, using passages like 1 Corinthians 16 and 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. But why do we say we don't have to tithe today? Because the tithe was a part of what? The old law. It was specifically mentioned and outlined and laid out in its fullness in the old law. But what's interesting is, here is Abraham well before the old law is ever established, and what is he doing? He's giving a tenth. And so he was tithing to God. And so the point that I've made of it is not that we specifically have to tithe, but I think we ought to be really careful when we think about giving less than a tenth. Because Abraham gave a tenth. The Israelites were demanded by law to give a tenth. And so I think sometimes we use the excuse that we don't have to tithe in the new covenant as an excuse to give less. And I think we should be careful about that. That's all I'll say about that. I should have said that in a good Forrest Gump voice. But anyway, so we've got Melchizedek. Melchizedek is whom according to this text? What are we told about him? He's king of Salem. What else do we know about him? He had no genealogy. What does that mean? Is Melchizedek just he just suddenly appears on the earth and then he's gone? What is meant by that, do you think? We're speculating to some extent. Oh, okay, we don't really know anything about him. We don't know his genealogy, whereas with important people in the Jewish history, genealogy was a really important thing, right? If you wanted to be a priest, what did you have to know? You had to know you were from the tribe of Levi, and more specifically, if you wanted to be a priest, you had to know you were from the family of Aaron. So if you weren't from the tribe of Levi and from the family of Aaron, could you be a priest? Did you even have to worry about it? No, that's not a possibility. So it was important that you know your genealogy in order to be able to establish that. It becomes important in the new covenant because for Jesus to be the Messiah and the king and the high priest, what had to be true? Yeah, he had to be a descendant of first, even before that. Who were the promises through? He had to be through Abraham. Okay, check number one, he's got that. Then he had to be through the specific tribe of Judah. Check, he's got that. And then from the tribe of Judah, he had to be specifically from the family of David. Check, he's got that. And we find that in those genealogies in both Matthew and Luke, that those are laid out. Interesting that those lineages are a little different. My opinion is the reason they're different is because Matthew gives the genealogy through Joseph. Why would he do that? It was written to Jews. Did they care who his mom was? The Jews care who his mom was? No. She's not important. Not really. In their mind. We know that's ridiculous, but the point is that's the way they viewed it. It's the father. So he had to be through Joseph. So he gives the lineage through Joseph. Luke, on the other hand, I think gives the lineage through Mary. That's significant because Luke's written. It seems as though Luke is primarily written to Gentiles, a specific Gentile, Theophilus, perhaps, or maybe that's a kind of a generic name for just those who love God. But anyway, the point is, he seems to give the lineage through Mary, and I think that's significant because was Joseph really Jesus' father? Nope. Adoptive, yes, but father, no. So if he was tied through the lineage of Joseph to David, but not through Mary, we got a problem, don't we? He's not really a direct descendant of David. But if he comes through both Mary and Joseph's lineage and fits that bill, then he is exactly who was prophesied. So that's my opinion. You can take that or leave it because it doesn't mean a whole lot. But so we've got this Melchizedek who has neither father nor mother. I don't think that necessarily means he didn't really have a father or mother. We just don't know who they are. He seems to have just been a man, right? Unless we're going to make the argument that he was the incarnate Jesus who appeared to Abraham on the way to back from the slaughter of the kings. I guess you could hold that opinion. I don't know that there's anything that suggests that it wasn't possibly true. I don't hold that as being the reason why this is all tied together the way that it is. I think he just means we don't know who his mom and dad are. We don't know where he began. We don't know when he ended. And so, like Jesus, he is an illustration of one who seemingly comes out of nowhere, and we don't know of his death. So it could be as though he continues on forever, and certainly with Jesus that's the case. But there are some other interesting facts that are mentioned here with regard to Melchizedek that I don't know that I'd noticed before. Look at there in verse 2. He is first by translation of his name. What? I'd never noticed that before. King of righteousness. And I mean, I take the grammar the way that it's written, that what it's telling us is that if you translate the name Melchizedek, what it means is King of righteousness. I found that interesting. I'd never noticed that before. So he is first by translation of his name King of righteousness, and then also King of Salem, that is King of peace. So he is the King of peace and righteousness by his name and by the location over which he ruled. But he is also significantly, back up in verse 1, priest of God Most High. That's important because under the old law in Israel, you had priests and you had kings. And never the two shall meet, correct? But in Jesus, the fulfillment, and here's another interesting point just as an aside. The word Messiah or Christ, anybody know what it really literally means, both in the Greek and the Hebrew? It means the anointed one. There were two anointed ones in the Old Testament law. Guess who they were? Kings and priests. Right? So under the old law, you had the anointed ones. In the new covenant, we have the anointed one. And there's only one. There's only one when it was established, and there is only one for all time. There will never be another anointed one. There's not going to be another one to take his place. And that's the part of the point the Hebrew writer makes in chapter 7 is there's no need for there to be another one to take his place. There was under the old covenant of necessity people to succeed the ones who were first established in those roles. But with Jesus, there is no need for it. And so there is the anointed one. He is anointed both king and priest of the Most High God. And not just priest, not just any old priest. He's the high priest. And he is, by his role, King of righteousness and King of peace and high priest of God Most High. And so Melchizedek's little story is given here in chapter 7, this first few verses, and shows us just a glimpse of this shadow of what Jesus came to be the fulfillment of. Now, in verses 4 through 9, the Hebrew writer makes, by inspiration, a really interesting argument. What is the argument? I just bring it up, not because I necessarily think that it has great significance overall in our relationship with God. It perhaps was significant or should have been significant to the Jews who were hearing this. But what does he say about, what argument does he make in this whole thing with regard to Abraham tithing to, there's a couple things. One is, if Abraham gave to Melchizedek, what does that tell us about Abraham and Melchizedek? Okay, Melchizedek's greater because the one who is greater blesses the one who is the lesser, right? And Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And Melchizedek didn't give tithes to Abraham. Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek. And so that's significant because it indicates that Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. So is there perhaps in this a little touch of what we've seen already in this book? Jesus is greater than the angels. Jesus is greater than Moses, who is the lawgiver and the one who took care of the house of God, but not the builder of the house. And now in chapter 7, Jesus is greater than whom? He's a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, and Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. then Jesus is greater than Abraham. And that's significant because the Jews considered there to be a few really, really important people, right? And they might have even had difficulty putting some of those people ahead of others. But there is no one they would have considered to be greater than our father Abraham. And yet Jesus is greater than Abraham. Jesus actually makes that point back in John with the Jewish leadership when he says that Abraham saw my day and was glad. And so the point that he's making again really is I am, and I am greater than Abraham. And so the Hebrew writer makes that point here. Jim. I rambled on so long, Jim forgot what he was talking about.
Yeah. Well, no, I was just going to say that it shows that Abraham was in subjection to Melchizedek, and,
Right.
and Jesus is greater than him. But he backs up. The Hebrew writer backs up even further when he says, Levi
Yes.
was still in the loins of Abraham. So of necessity, it says that he was in subjection.
Yes, and the point really, and like I said, I'm not sure it's really significant for us, but it would have been significant for the Jews who were hearing this or reading this, is that what's being established in Hebrews chapter 7 really, yeah, he makes mention of the fact, at least alludes to the fact that Jesus is greater than Abraham, but what's really being established is there were two priesthoods now in their mind. Jesus is being considered a priest. He's a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. But they already had a lot of priests who were serving according to the old law. They were of the order of Aaron. And so what's really being established in Hebrews chapter 7 is that Jesus' priesthood, according to the order of Melchizedek, is greater than the priesthood that was established by the first law. That's really what's in comparison here in this particular chapter. And so in making the statement that Melchizedek was greater than Abraham because Abraham tied to Melchizedek, and then saying that there is a sense in which at least Levi himself paid tithes to Melchizedek through Abraham since he was still in Abraham's loins, which is an interesting argument in and of itself to think of, this fact that, is it true in some sense? Yes, the seed that was necessary for Isaac was within Abraham. And then that seed became the seed that produced Jacob and Esau, right? And that seed then becomes the one through whom the 12 tribes of Israel come, and so on and so forth. So it's through Abraham as the father of all that. And so there is some sense in which, and I just find it interesting that he makes that argument. But the real point behind it is, Levi paid tribute to Melchizedek, who was greater than Abraham, making Melchizedek greater than Levi and Aaron and the priests of old. They, in essence, paid tithes through Abraham as well. And Jesus is greater than all of those, and therefore that makes him the greatest. Why would you turn to this old priesthood, which, by the way, it becomes a little bit of a debatable topic as to how well they really knew their lineages in the first century anyway. Because of the exile that occurred in Babylon, and then after that, all of the difficulties brought on by the Greeks and then later by the Romans, and all of the scattering that had occurred of the Jews throughout the world at that present time during the first century, it was really difficult. In fact, I think one of the significances of Paul's bragging, and I put that in quotation marks, Samantha, in Philippians chapter 3, one of the reasons that it is significant that Paul brags about his tribe in Philippians 3 is that it was not an exceptionally common thing for first century Jews to know the tribe they came from. And so for him to be able to say, I come from the tribe of Benjamin, and I know the family that I come from, and it's the namesake of Benjamin, Saul. And so he talks about all of that as though it's significant and something to brag about because it wasn't common. So my reason for saying all that is it's somewhat debatable how many of the priests actually even really strongly knew that they were from the tribe of Levi. And yet these Hebrew Christians are in danger of wanting to leave the true priest, the priest according to the order of Melchizedek, Jesus, who provided better sacrifices and a better covenant and better things all the way around, and go back to this inferior priesthood that at this present time was probably a mere hint of what it was when it was established generations before, but they're thinking about going back to that. And do we know why? I know we haven't gotten into this too much yet, but why are they wanting to go? Why are they drawn to go back to the old covenant? They knew it. There's a significant reason, perhaps a little more significant reason in chapter 10, though. That is true. It was familiar to them. They knew it. They understood it. And they knew it was established. Who established it? What was the origin? It was from God. So, I mean, it can't be bad, right? I mean, it came from God. God's the one that gave it through Moses. But in chapter 10, there's perhaps a more significant reason why they felt inclined to go back to it. And I know I'm asking you to look ahead if you haven't already. It's a reason why a lot of people were struggling at this present time in different places. There were Judaizing teachers, but these Judaizing teachers had at this present time gone from just being people who were trying to push the law of Moses on everybody to, and they had done this a little bit throughout history, beginning really in Acts chapter 8, but they were persecuting. And so if your life is being threatened and you could go back and just follow the old covenant that originated with God anyway and avoid all of this persecution, would that not be enticing to some extent? Yeah, but he is trying to impress on them the inferiority of all of that old law. It was a shadow. Jesus is the substance. Justin.
I was just going to say, and to think about it in the sense of like how politicized the priesthood had become.
Yes.
And to know, like, you know, we can think about just analogous, you know, maybe how closer to the truth and more principled, you know, our founding was, and we kind of look back on that with a sense of reverence or nostalgia even.
Sure.
But you know, we think of how far we've come from that in our modern political system. Where here these Jews were looking at the old covenant through these highly politicized priests, and to want to go back to that as if that was something to be desired.
Right.
Makes you think how big a part the persecution played in it, because you couldn't look at the priesthood and the Sanhedrin and think, boy, these are really righteous guys.
Right.
We ought to follow them.
Right.
There was nothing like that I think would draw you back.
No, it was not a model of righteousness in any sense. And so, but like I said, the point here in chapter 7 is Jesus' priesthood is greater than the priests of old. And he's going to explain why in this latter half of the chapter. Okay. The first thing he says in verse 11 is, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, and then he makes this aside again, for under it the people receive the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek? So his argument is what? What was the first priesthood unable to do? You can make it as simple as he did. It was unable to make us perfect. It was unable to be perfect. It was not perfect. And it was not perfect in a whole lot of ways. But in this particular place, it was not able to make us perfect, is the point that is being made. But, I mean, what Emily said is true, because not only was it not able to make us perfect, that first priesthood was not perfect in any sense. And Justin made mention of this too. The reality is, even in its best day, even in its glory days, when you had good priests like Aaron and others that served. Phinehas is another one that I think Hophni and Phinehas came much later. Was there who was the one after Nadab and Abihu died? Days of Moses, Book of Numbers. Oh, was it Eleazar?
I mean, no, Phineas is one who.
That's the one I was thinking of was Phinehas. So not the Hophni and Phinehas of Eli's day, but the Phinehas before who ran the Moabite woman and the Jew through was the one that I was thinking of. Which I know that's not it's like, wow, you would think of that one. No, I mean, he was a righteous guy. God even calls him out for his righteousness. My point is just that even in its glory days, when there were good priests, good high priests, it still paled in comparison to what God wanted. Why? What was true of every one of those priests? And he talks about it here in this text right now. And he talked about it earlier. Okay, that's one problem. They all die. So, I mean, if you got a great priest and it's like, man, this guy is so good, I wish he could live forever. And then like every other human on the planet, he dies at some point. And now what do you got? I mean, what happens?
His corrupt son.
Yeah, I mean, you're rolling the dice. I mean, it could be, the next guy could be great, and the next guy could be horrible. I mean, you've got the Eli's of the world. Eli seems to have been a good priest, right? And then you've got his sons. How are they? Not so good. So, I mean, you were rolling the dice every time. It's like sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. So they died. That was a problem. What else was true? Even with the good ones, there's something in this text. Even with the good ones, what's true? Yes, they died. That's true too. They sinned. I mean, so they had to first offer sacrifices for themselves so that they could even be in the right frame of relationship with God to offer sacrifices for the people. So that was a problem. I mean, here you've got these guys that are imperfect in their own very nature who are offering sacrifices. They're trying to be mediators between God and men, and they've got their own faults. And so that's an issue. And so that was another aspect of this first priesthood that was inferior and weak, and a reason why. And then they offered these sacrifices. What were they offering?
Animals.
They were offering animals, blood of bulls and goats and other things. And the reality is, if they'd offered their own blood, would it have been any better? No. I mean, it would have been, I guess there's some sense in which, at least then it was the sacrifice of one who had sinned, but it doesn't act as a sacrifice for anybody else. It would just act as a sacrifice for themselves. I'm offering my own life because I've sinned against you, and that's the payment I ought to pay. So, I mean, from that standpoint, maybe a little better, but it still it doesn't provide forgiveness, is the point. And so they're offering inferior sacrifices. They are inferior men because they sin, and they die. And so all of those things are a problem. And so then we've got Jesus who comes along, and he is what? He's without sin. He's unblemished. And therefore he offers as a sacrifice, not animals, but himself, because he can be a sacrifice for sin. He can be the sacrifice for sin that provides true forgiveness as a substitute for the ones who've really sinned. And he lives forever to make intercession before God for us. So he does all of those things. He takes all of the things that made the first priesthood inferior, and he wipes the slate clean, and he comes in and he provides everything that is better. He is established. He is a perfect priest. He doesn't die, so we don't have to worry about somebody else taking his place and being inferior to him. He provides better sacrifices by the sacrifice of himself. And the Hebrew writer at least mentions it in this text, but he will go into greater detail later. But they offered, how many sacrifices they offer in the Old Covenant? Throw out a number, I'd be impressed, because there's a bunch. I mean, there's some sacrifices where there were thousands of sacrifices that were offered on one occasion. It's like, wow. So there had to be countless I don't know, millions of animals that were slaughtered in Israel throughout the history that they had, and not a one of them provided an ounce of forgiveness. And Jesus, on the other hand, comes along. How many sacrifices he offer? One. One every year? Nope. One sacrifice for all time. So everything about his priesthood is better. You want to go back to that old way? I mean, there's a sense in which I think the Hebrew writer a few times makes the point, you want to go back to that? What is wrong with you? I mean, he may not be quite that direct, but that's essentially what he's saying. What is wrong with you? Look at this man. Look at everything about him. Everything about Jesus is superior. Everything about his covenant is superior. We'll talk a little bit more about chapter 7. We've covered the highlights, but there's a point that I want to make about the law that we didn't touch on in the middle of Hebrews chapter 7. But you might be ready on Wednesday night to get into chapter 8, because that would actually be a perfect segue. We'll talk about the changing of the law and what the reason for that and why that was, and then we'll move into chapter 8, which talks about the changing of the law. So, thanks for your help. Appreciate the comments this morning, and we'll look forward to